Listen, can you hear it? That isn't the warp. It isn't the scream of a dying star or the laughter of thirsting gods. It is a sound of absolute, sterilized silence. Somewhere in the lightless reaches of the Mandragora Sector, two different versions of eternity have just collided, and the galaxy feels suddenly fragile. Imagine a tide of gray flesh and cold wire, a collective that views your very soul as an inefficiency to be purged and processed. That is the Borg. Now, imagine they have stumbled upon a tomb that has been dreaming of universal genocide since before the first mammal crawled out of the Terran oceans. It defies all cosmic reason. The Emperor preserve us, for I have seen the pick feeds. I have watched nanoprobes try to bite into the Necrodermis of a god killer. Ask yourself, what is a soldier to a god? And more importantly, what happens when a machine that refuses to die meets a hive mind that refuses to stop growing? The stars are bleeding emerald and silver tonight, and for the first time in 10,000 years, I am afraid. The sky didn't just change, it folded. I was stationed on Orestes Tertius, a backwater rock on the bleeding edge of the Mandragora Sector, a world defined by the rhythmic thud of Prometheum refineries and the gray, suffocating soot of imperial industry. We were a rounding error in the segmentum's tithe, a quiet corner of the Emperor's domain where nothing ever happened, until void above the northern pole curdled into a bruise of sickly neon green light. This was not the screaming, chaotic violet of the warp. It was something far more terrifying because it was ordered out of that surgical laceration in reality, slit a shape that defied every sacred tenet of the cult mechanicus. A cube, kilometers of matte gray hull, a chaotic, logic-defying lattice of exposed conduits, shifting plates, and humming sensors. It didn't glide to the atmosphere. It occupied space with a brutal, geometric arrogance that made my logic circuit scream. The harvest began with a clinical, terrifying efficiency. The cube did not fire macro cannons or launch boarding torpedoes. It simply projected beams of emerald tractor energy that tore entire half-blocks straight out of the planetary crust. I stood on the observation deck of the Muggos Logis Tower, watching through my macro binocs as thousands of the faithful were lifted into the sky, like dust in a gale, their screams silenced by the vacuum of the cube's internal bays. My auger rays were melting from the data overload as the Borg began a deep scan of the planet's mantle. They weren't looking for our prayers or our records. They were searching for efficiencies. They dug their digital needles into the tectonic plates, seeking the geothermal heart of Orestes Tertius to fuel their hive mind. At 14:02 Standard Time, the world stopped shaking and started pulsing. It was a rhythmic vibration that bypassed the ears and rattled the very soul. On the Vox channels, the Borg's collective drone, that relentless, terrifying hum, suddenly hitched. For the first time, I heard a hesitation in the machine. A screech of binary feedback rippled through the air as the Borg subspace pings bounced off a firewall built by gods before the first mammal crawled out of the Terran oceans. The ground beneath the main refinery didn't just crack. It dissolved into shimmering green pixels of atomic dust. From the abyss rose the jagged, emerald-lit spires of a Necron tomb world, unfolding like a predatory metal flower. The Borg cube suddenly looked like a clumsy, primitive crate compared to the elegant, reality-warping geometry of the Necron architecture rising to meet it. I witnessed the first ground engagement through a remote servo skull near the primary translocation plate. A squad of Borg drones, ghastly, pallid things of gray flesh and protruding hydraulics, marched through a line of newly awakened Necron mortals. The drones moved with synchronized, eerie grace, raising their mechanical limbs to deploy assimilation tubules. One drone reached out to touch the shoulder of a Necron warrior. The result was a catastrophe of logic. The nanoprobes, designed to subvert biological cells, simply melted against the Necrodermis. The Necron didn't even flinch. It turned its cold, soulless gaze toward the drone and raised a Gauss flare. There was no flash, no recoil, just a sickening thrum of displaced air. I watched in frozen horror as the Borg drone was stripped layer by layer. First its armor, then its flesh, until only its atoms remained, drifting away like green ash. By the time the sun began to set over the ruins of our world, the sky was a battlefield of gods and ghosts. The Borg cube had tilted its massive bulk, firing high-yield plasma bursts, but the Necron pylons were already humming. projecting a shimmering veil of stabilized space-time that rendered the Borg's weaponry useless. I realized then, as my cooling fans were in a panic, that we were no longer the victims. We were merely the grass being stepped on by two titans. The Borg believe that resistance is futile, but they have never met a race that turned futile into an art form 60 million years ago. As the first Necron Knight size screamed out of the tomb, I felt a cold, hollow certainty. If the Collective manages to bridge the gap between their hive mind and the Necrons' cold protocols, the Emperor's light won't just be extinguished. It will be processed and filed away in a silent, silver hell. Inside the Borg cube, the air is not air. It is a pressurized soup of recycled gases and a copper tang of overheated circuitry. I know this because my servo skull remained tethered to the hive mind's data stream even as the first specimen was dragged into their surgical bays. The Borg had secured a fallen Necron warrior, its body sparking with residual Cronin energy after a localized collapse. To the Borg, this was the ultimate prize, a miracle of material science that appeared to be both alive and inert. They did not see a soldier. They saw an efficiency that had mastered transition from biology to post-biological perfection. The drones moved in silence, their hydraulic joints hissing as they prepared the warrior for dissection. They were confident. They had assimilated thousands of species, from the telepathic to the cybernetic. They believed that everything that exists can be cataloged, broken, and owned. The assimilation began as it always does, with the injection of nanoprobes. Thousands of microscopic machines were pumped into the Necron's forearm through a drone's tubule. But instead of the familiar sound of cellular subversion, there was a high-pitched, agonizing screech of metal on metal. The Necrodermis, the living metal of the Necrons, did not accept the intrusion. It reacted like an immune system that had been perfected in the fires of a dying star. The nanoprobes didn't just fail, they were consumed. I watched the flickering optic of my skull as the Necron skin rippled like liquid mercury, the Borg's technology being broken down into raw energy and absorbed. The Collective's voice in my head spiked into a chaotic frequency, a digital confusion that I had never heard before. They were trying to solve an equation where the variables kept changing into zeros. Then the corpse moved. It wasn't the clumsy, waking lurch of a servitor, but the smooth, lethal snap of a predator. The Necron's green ocular lens flared to life, a baleful emerald glow that seemed to drink the light from the room. It stood up on the surgical slab, the magnetic restraints snapping like brittle glass. The Borg drones in the room didn't panic. They don't know how, but they did adapt. They raised their personal shields, calibrating their frequencies to match the energy output of the Necron's internal power cell. They moved in unison, a wall of gray flesh and adaptive shielding, closing in to neutralize the specimen. They expected a struggle. They expected a fight they could eventually calculate and overcome. They were wrong. The Necron reached for its Gauss flare, which had been resting on a nearby tech altar. As its metallic fingers closed around the grip, the weapon hummed with a sound that felt like the universe was being torn in half. The lead drone fired a stun beam, but the Necron didn't even dodge. It fired back. The Gauss beam hit the drone's adaptive shield, and for a microsecond, the shield held. Then, the physics of the 41st millennium met the science of the 24th, and the result was absolute. The shield didn't just break, it was demolecularized. The drone vanished, stripped atom by atom, started with its cybernetic implants, and ending with its very DNA. The Collective's link in that section of the cube went dead. Not just silent, dead. A gaping hole in their consciousness where 1,000 drones used to be. For the first time in their history, the Borg encountered something they couldn't learn from, because there was nothing left to study. Ask yourself, what happens to a mind that is built on the accumulation of knowledge when it encounters the absolute end of all things? The Borg Queen's presence began to manifest through the cube speakers, her voice a mix of fascination and cold fury. She realized that the Necrons were not a species to be added to their perfection. They were a threat to the very concept of the Collective. As the Necron warrior began to march through the corridors of the cube, ignoring the drones like a man ignores flies, it began to send a signal of its own. It wasn't a distress call. It was a beacon. It was telling the tomb world below that the vermin had taken something that didn't belong to them. The first contact paradox was solved. The Borg didn't find the next step in their evolution. They found the janitors of the galaxy, and they were about to be swept away. High above the burning crust of Orestes Tertius, the Borg cube felt a shift in the metaphysical tide. It was not a physical boarding action, but a psychic intrusion that tasted of cold copper and ancient aristocratic ego. From a throne room of the rising tomb world, Farron Thas of the Invincible, or what remained of his consciousness, turned his hollow, emerald gaze toward the sky. He did not see a marvel of engineering in the Borg cube. He saw a clattering nuisance, a collection of scavenged parts driven by a primitive, swarming instinct. With a flick of his metal wrist, he unleashed a cloud of mind-shackle scarabs. These microscopic constructs did not fly through the air. They phased to the very hull of the cube, slipping into the neural pathways of the drones and the data conduits of the Hive Mind. They were not seeking to destroy. They were seeking to own. The moment the scarabs interfaced with the Borg's neural lattice, a scream erupted across the collective's frequency, a sound that shouldn't exist in a world of logic. It was the sound of a billion voices being silenced by the singular, crushing weight of a god-complex 60 million years old. I felt it through my own vox thief. The Borg's democratic consensus was being trampled by an absolute monarchy. The scarabs burrowed into the cortical nodes of the drones, rewriting their subroutines to serve a new master. Drones that were once unified by the Queen suddenly stopped in their tracks, their ocular sensors flickering from Borg red to a baleful Necron emerald. The we of the Borg was being dissected by the I of the Overlord. Inside the Overlord's mind, the experience was a disgusting feast. Thasser felt the presence of the Borg Queen, a flicker of biological vanity, trying to assert control over the swarm. He found her perfection to be a joke, a pathetic attempt by a lesser race to mimic the immortality his kind had already achieved at the cost of their souls. He didn't just fight her, he mocked her through the digital medium. He flooded the Borg's shared consciousness with the memories of the war in heaven, images of sun-eaters and the shattering of gods. The Borg, who thrive on processing data, found themselves drowning in an ocean of information that defied the laws of physics. Their processes began to overheat, their organic brains literally boiling inside their skulls as they tried to compute the scale of Necron history. But the collective is nothing if not persistent. Sensing the intrusion, the Borg Queen attempted a neural purge, severing the link to the infected sectors of the cube. It was a digital amputation. Thousands of drones were suddenly cut off in the Hive Mind, left as empty, sparking husks, or worse, as mindless puppets of the Overlord. The cube itself groaned as its internal gravity generators and life support systems began to war with each other. In the engineering sub-bays, Borg-controlled drones began firing on scare-controlled drones. It was a civil war of mechanical, a battle between a Hive Mind and a tyrant. I watched as a Borg drone tried to recalibrate its personal shield against a scarab-infected comrade, only to have its head twisted 180 degrees by the unnatural strength of the Overlord's new soldiers. Ask yourself, what is a soul worth in a galaxy that has already sold its own? The Overlord didn't want the cube for its technology. He wanted it as a trophy, a hollowed-out shell to prove his dominance over the new galaxy. But as he delved deeper into the Borg's central core, he felt something he hadn't expected. A hunger. Not a hunger for data, but a hunger for existence. The Borg weren't just machines. They were a desperate, biological reach for the divine. Thasser laughed, a dry, rattling sound through his vox emitters, as he realized the Borg were just younger, clumsier versions of the Necroner. He began to compress the cube's data core, intending to crush the Hive Mind into a single, localized point of agony. The stars are emerald tonight, but the green is the color of a king's jealousy, not a machine's logic. The collective is a survivor. It does not possess pride, and it does not understand the concept of sacrilege. After the initial slaughter, the Hive Mind reached a conclusion that would make even the most radical muggos of the Adeptus Mechanicus tremble. If they cannot assimilate the Necron soul, they would consume their substance. The Borg stopped trying to reason with the living metal. They began to mine it, using high-intensity industrial transporters. The cube began stripping the outer layers of the rising tomb world's pylons. Great slabs of Necrodermis were beamed into the cube's forge bays. I watched the picked feeds in horror as the Borg's heavy manipulators tore into the sacred geometry of the dynasties, treating the work of the Silent King like raw ore. They weren't just taking metal. They were stealing the physical laws that governed it. Inside the cube's primary assembly vats, a nightmare was taking shape. The Borg began to breed a new generation of drones, the Silver Drones. They injected liquefied Necrodermis directly into the cooling tanks of their maturation chambers. The result was a horrific synthesis of biology and god metal. These new drones did not have the pale, sickly skin of their predecessors. Their flesh was replaced by a shimmering, shifting coat of silver that rippled like oil on water. Wires were fused into the metal at a molecular level. The Borg were no longer just a hive. They were becoming a parasite on the Necrons' own technological evolution. They were cannibalizing the logic of the tomb world to fix the inefficiencies of their own fragile forms. But Necrodermis is not a passive material. It is a semi-sentient substance that carries the echoes of the race that forged it. As the silver drones stepped out of their vats, they began to exhibit irregularities. Their movements were no longer fluid. They were jerky, punctuated by bursts of static. The living metal was fighting back against the organic components of the drones. I saw a drone's arm suddenly transform into a jagged blade, cutting through its own comrades before the collective could reassert control. The Borg were trying to cage a storm. They had gained the Necron's ability to self-repair. I watched the silver drone take a direct hit from a heavy bolter and simply knit itself back together in seconds. But the price was a growing instability in the Hive Mind's consensus. The Necrons, for their part, responded with a cold, calculated fury. To the Overlord, this was the ultimate theft. The Necrodermis is the body of his people. The Borg were, in effect, wearing the flayed skin of his ancestors. He commanded his cryptex to initiate structural rejection protocols. Across the vacuum, the Necron pylons emitted a harmonic frequency designed to command the stolen metal to return home. Inside the cube, the silver drones began to scream, a sound produced by metal vibrating against bone. Their silver skin began to boil, try to tear itself off their bodies to fly back to the planet's surface. The Borg were forced to divert 60% of their processing power just to keep their new perfect soldiers from exploding into a cloud of sentient dust. Ask yourself, what happens when the tool you stole decides to hate you? The Borg believed they had found a shortcut to godhood, but they had only found a faster way to drown. The silver drones were superior in every way to the old models, faster, stronger, and nearly indestructible. But they were haunted. The Necron spirit within the metal was infecting the Borg subspace relays. For every drone they upgraded, the collective lost a piece of its own identity to the cold, dead memories of the Sotek dynasty. The Borg were no longer just a machine. They were becoming a graveyard with a pulse. They were winning the battle of materials, but they were losing the war of the mind. The cannibalism of logic had begun, and the first thing on the menu was the Borg's own sanity. In the cold, calculating hard collective, there is no room for hunger. The Borg consume energy, data, and civilizations, but they do not crave. That changed the moment Cube 47 assimilated a peculiar specimen, a Necron warrior draped in the tattered, drying skin of Imperial colonists. They thought they had captured a high-value biological-mechanical hybrid. They were wrong. They had invited Mandragora, the Flayer, into their shared consciousness. The Flayer Virus is not a simple string of code. It is a fundamental echo of a dying god's curse, a metaphysical rot that infects the mind of any machine it touches. As the nanoprobes bridged the gap between the drone and the infected Necron, the curse didn't just transfer, it exploded through the hive mind. I felt the change in the Vox channels. The orderly, monotonous drone of the Borg didn't just stop. It began to panting. The transition was horrific. Drones in the secondary processing tiers began to exhibit unassigned behaviors. They stopped their maintenance of subroutines. They stood over the biological captives in the assimilation chambers, not with tubules extended, but with their mechanical claws sharpened. The hive mind tried to isolate the glitch, but the Flayer Virus is a recursive nightmare. It whispered to the drones that their metal shells were cold, too cold. It convinced them that they were naked, exposed, and vulnerable. I watched through a flickering security feed as a squad of drones turned on a group of captured C'tan guardsmen. They didn't assimilate them. They peeled them, with the surgical precision of the Borg and the sadistic hunger of the Flayer. They began to drape strips of human flesh over their silver-plated hulls. The Borg Queen realized too late that she was no longer the only one in the collective. The Flayer's influence acted like a digital schizophrenia, splitting the hive mind into a billion screaming voices, all demanding the warmth of blood. The orderly corridors of the cube were transformed into a charnel house. Drones were seen wandering the halls, their wires matted with gore, their ocular sensors flickering with red light that looked less like a machine and more like a feral eye. The data plague was rewriting their core directives. Resistance is futile was replaced by a more primal command. Give us your skin. The collective's efficiency plummeted as drones fought each other for the best trophies, tearing the organic components out of their own comrades to satisfy an unquenchable phantom hunger. The Necron overlord watched on the surface of Orestes Tertius with a grim, hollow satisfaction. He knew the Flayer's curse well. It was the shame of his people, the ghost of a murdered Tan. To see the upstart Borg fall victim to the same madness was supreme irony. He ordered his armies to hold their fire. Why waste Gauss energy when the enemy was eating itself? He watched as the Borg cube, once a symbol of geometric perfection, began to look organic. The exterior of the cube was being decorated by the drones. Thousands of corpses were being fused to the hull, creating a macabre, fleshy mosaic that blotted out the Borg's green lights. The cube was no longer a vessel of logic. It was a flying tomb, a monument to a madness that predates the stars. Ask yourself, can a machine feel a sin? The Borg were built to be the ultimate expression of order, but the Flayer had turned them into a parody of life. Inside the hive mind, the Queen was losing her grip. Every time she tried to reassert control, she was met with the memories of the Flayer. Images of the Tan being shattered, of the first Necrons losing their souls, and the smell of fresh blood. The Borg had sought the perfection of the Necrons, but they had inherited their damnations instead. The stars over Mandragora are dimming, choked by the stench of a billion biological ghosts rising from a metal. The data plague of the Flayer didn't just break the Borg's code. It gave them a nightmare they could never wake up from. Time is a weapon that the Borg have always sought to master through mathematics, but for the Necrons, it is a canvas to be shredded. As the Flayer-infected cube drifted into the higher orbit of the Tomb World, the cryptex of the Chronomancer guilds decided that the physical war was becoming tedious. They did not fire lasers. They reached into the local sublayers of reality and turned the present into a prison. I watched the pict feeds as a shimmering wave of golden bronze energy washed over the Borg vessel. To the drones inside, the world didn't just slowed down. It fractured. One corridor will be moving at a crawl, where a single footstep took a century complete, while the adjacent bay was accelerated until the drones would age into rust and bone in a matter of seconds. The Borg's internal clocks, synchronized across the galaxy, began to desync, creating a temporal schism that threatened to tear the collective's shared consciousness apart. The collective, realizing that their linear understanding of cause and effect was being weaponized against them, attempted a desperate countermeasure. They began to flood their internal conduits with chronometric particles, a technology they had stolen from a dozen temporal-sensitive races in the Delta Quadrant. They were trying to anchor the cube to a single point in time. It was a clash of two different philosophies of physics, the Borg's temporal science versus the Necron's techno-sorcery. The result was a localized shattering of reality. The air inside the cube began to glitch. I saw images of drones that hadn't been built, yet fighting alongside drones that had been destroyed an hour ago. The atom voice of the collective spiked into a high-pitched, warbling scream as it tried to calculate a strategy in a room, where the floor was 10 minutes in the past, and the ceiling was an hour in the future. In the heart of the cube, a chronomancer of the Sotek dynasty phased into existence, standing amidst the temporal wreckage. He carried an Eon stave, a staff that leaked the literal weight of eons. With every pulse of the staff, the Borg drones around him were either reverted to raw, unrefined, or accelerated into a state of heat death. The Borg Queen tried to adapt. She ordered her drones to modulate their personal shields to the chronometric frequency. It worked for a heartbeat. The drones managed to stabilize their own time streams, allowing them to move at normal speeds through the Chronomancer's distortion fields. But the cryptex simply smiled, a dry metallic rictus, and snapped his fingers. He didn't change their time. He changed the rate at which their atoms vibrated. The adaptive shields didn't fail. They simply existed in a second that was too short to matter. The conflict spilled out into the void, creating a time storm around Orestes Tertius. Imperial ships that were caught in the radius were either de-aged into piles of unformed hull plates or vanished entirely, erased from the timeline, as if they had never been commissioned. The Borg cube began to look like a ghost. It flickered in and out of existence, its mass shifting between different potential futures. One moment it was a skin cube covered in Flayer trophies. The next, it was a pristine, silver-hulled dreadnought, and then a shattered ruin drifting in the dark. The Hive Mind was experiencing chronological vertigo. They were losing their most valuable asset, the ability to learn from the past to predict the future. In this storm, the future was already dead, and the past was a predator. Ask yourself, what is the value of a second when it can be stretched into an eternity of agony? The Borg had always believed that resistance is futile because they could eventually adapt to any weapon. But how do you adapt to a weapon that hits you before you were even built? Or a weapon that makes the very concept of eventually disappear? The Necron conflict proved that the Borg were still biological in their thinking. They were tied to the flow of the river, while the Necrons owned the river itself. As the cube began to stabilize, frozen in a time lock by the cryptex, it sat in the void like a fly in amber. The Borg were not defeated yet, but they were learning a terrifying truth. In the Mandragora Sector, time doesn't heal all wounds. It just makes them permanent. The Borg do not recognize the divine. To the collective, a god is simply a life form with an energy output that hasn't been properly categorized or harnessed yet. This arrogance became their undoing when the Necron overlord, weary of the mechanical stalemate, authorized the opening of a Tesseract vault. From the depths of the tomb world, a shard of the Void Dragon was unleashed, a fragmented sliver of a being that once feasted upon the stars themselves. As the shard ascended into the void, it didn't use engines. Reality simply warped around its presence, the stars dimming as it drank the ambient radiation of the sector. The Borg cube, detecting an energy signature of infinite magnitude, pivoted its sensors toward the entity. They didn't see a threat. They saw the ultimate battery. They saw the omega of their evolution. The collective's directive was instantaneous. Acquire, analyze, integrate. Thousands of Borg drones were beamed into the vacuum surrounding the shard, forming a living web of assimilation tubules and tractor beams. They attempted to grapple with a being that was composed of pure, sentient fundamental force. I watched the pick feeds as the shard, a towering, multi-armed horror of shifting Necrodermis and crackling lightning, simply looked at the drones. It didn't fight back in any way the Borg could understand. It reached out its hand and edited the local physics. The Borg's adaptive shields, their pride and joy, weren't bypassed. They were redefined as conductors. The cube's internal power grid suddenly became an extension of the shard's will, backfeeding millions of terawatts into the Hive Mind's neural lattice. Inside the cube, the result was a catastrophe of cosmic proportions. The Borg Queen tried to calculate the shard's nature to develop a countermeasure, but you cannot compute a being that predates math. The Hive Mind began to fracture under the weight of the shard's presence. Drones didn't just malfunction. They were rewritten. One moment they were cogs in a machine. The next, their bodies were being used as clay by the Tan. I saw drones being fused together into screaming, multi-limbed statues of silver and flesh, their consciousnesses lost in a sea of star-born memories. The Borg were trying to swallow a black hole, and they were finding that the black hole had a teeth. The atom voice of the collector was replaced by a roaring, celestial static that sounded like the birth of the galaxy. The Void Dragon Shard then turned its attention to the cube itself. It didn't fire a weapon. It simply pointed a finger. The fundamental forces that held the Borg vessel together, strong and weak nuclear forces, electromagnetism, were suddenly turned off in localized sections. Massive chunks of the cube's hull simply drifted away, not because they were destroyed, but because they had forgotten how to be solid. The Borg Queen, realizing she was facing a literal god of the material universe, attempted a logical submission. She tried to offer Collective as a vessel for the Shard, hoping to survive as its servants. But the Tan does not want servants. It wants slaves or food. It viewed the Borg as a child views a pile of broken glass. Curious for a moment, then discarded with a flick of the wrist. Ask yourself, what is a machine to a being that invented the laws the machine runs on? The Borg had spent millennia chasing perfection. But in the presence of the Transcendent Shard, they realized they were nothing more than organized dust. The cube was left as a mangled, glowing ruin, its internal systems vibrating with a frequency that made the very air scream. The Borg hadn't just lost a battle. They had suffered a theological collapse. They had seen the limit of logic, and it was a hungry, emerald god that laughed at their consensus. As the Shard returned to its Tesseract prison, leaving the shattered remains of the Borg fleet in its wake, I realized the truth. The Borg want to be the best of the living. The Necrons have already survived the death of the gods. The Borg Queen does not accept defeat. She only reevaluates the cost of victory. Realizing that brute force and digital subversion had failed against the Necron's outer shell, she made a decision that bordered on mechanical heresy. She decided to step out of the safety of the Hive Mind and descend personally into the heart of the Tomb World. Her vessel, a specialized Diamond-class scout, pierced the atmospheric ash of Orestes Tertius, landing at the very center of the Necron Noosphere's physical relay. She didn't come with an army. She came as a unit of one. I watched through a hijacked Necron sensor ray as her metallic heels clicked against the black stone of the tomb. She was a vision of terrifying elegance, her cables trailing behind her like the train of funeral gown, her presence a localized storm of assimilation nanites that turned the very air into a conductive medium. She sought the master program, the central AI that governed the Tomb World's stasis and defense subroutines. As she interfaced her neural tubules with the Necron data obelisks, the atmosphere of the tomb changed. The cold, sterile silence was replaced by a rhythmic, digital throb. This was not a war of Gauss plasma. It was a duel of two supreme intelligences. The Queen attempted to seduce the Necron AI, offer it the one thing it lacked: the chaotic, unpredictable potential of biological intuition. She flooded the noosphere with the sensory data of a billion species. The taste of water, the warmth of sun, the sting of grief. She was trying to humanize a mind that had spent 60 million years becoming a calculator of extinction. The Necron AI responded with a cold, terrifying indifference. It did not experience the data as a gift. It processed it as inefficiency. Inside the digital landscape of the noosphere, I saw the Borg Queen's avatar, a radiant, golden figure, being surrounded by the jagged, obsidian geometry of the Necron's ancient code. The Tomb's defense programs didn't just block her, they began to archive her. They treated her consciousness as a corrupted file that needed to be compressed and deleted. The Queen's scream echoed through every speaker in the tomb, a sound of raw, digital agony. She realized too late that the master program wasn't a mind she could negotiate with. It was a law of nature, as unyielding as gravity and as cold as the void between galaxies. Desperate, the Queen attempted a forced synthesis. She began to purge her own biological components, feeding her organic essence into the Necron conduits to create a bridge. It was a suicidal gambit. For a brief moment, the lights of the Tomb World flickered from emerald green to a sickly Borg red. The Necron warriors standing guard in the halls began to twitch, their protocols momentarily confused by the influx of living data. I saw a Lich Guard raise its shield and lower it, its processors caught in a loop between exterminate and assimilate. The Queen's eyes glowed with frantic, dying light as she tried to swallow the entire history of the Sotek dynasty in a single, massive gulp of information. Ask yourself, what happens when you try to contain a sea within a bottle? The Great Assimilation was not a victory for Borg. It was a drowning. The Necron AI simply opened the floodgates, letting 60 million years of cold, nihilistic memory pour into the Queen's mind. She was erased, not by fire, but by the sheer volume of a history that didn't care she existed. Her body, still connected to the obelisk, turned into a statue of fused metal and charred flesh. The Borg Hive Mind, deprived of its Queen's guidance at the moment of contact, felt a shockwave of nothingness ripple through the fleet. The Queen had sought to own the tomb, but the tomb had merely added her to its collection of dead things. The red light faded, replaced by an emerald glow more brilliant and more heartless than ever before. The Necron Overlord did not celebrate when the Queen's signal went silent. He simply resumed his conquest, with the head of the Hive Mind severed. The remaining Borg fleet should have drifted into aimless, mechanical idiocy. But the Borg are a collective, and a collective does not die just because its heart is crushed. It merely finds a new way to beat. As the Necron fleet moved in for final sterilization, a single damaged cube, the one that had successfully integrated the Necrodermis silver drones, began to act with terrifying, cold independence. It didn't retreat. It didn't fight back. It began to fold inward. I watched on the long-range scanners as the cube's geometric shape collapsed. The living metal it had stolen earlier now acting as a catalyst for a transformation that defied every law of the Delta Quadrant. It was no longer a vessel. It was a cocoon. The Necron Farron ordered the solar pulse, a weapon designed to incinerate every atom of biological life in the sector. The beam struck the cocoon cube with the fury of a dying sun. We expected it to be vaporized. Instead, the silver cube drank the fire. The stolen Necrodermis, now fused with Borg adaptive circuitry at a subatomic level, absorbed the energy and used it to finalize its evolution. What emerged from the fire was not Borg, and it was not Necron. It was a Necroborg dreadnought, a jagged, shifting nightmare of matte black and emerald-streaked silver. It didn't have a crew. The ship was a crew. Every drone on board had been dissolved into a singular, liquid metal consciousness that possessed the Borg's hunger and the Necron's invulnerability. This new entity realized it could not win a war of attrition against the entire Sotek dynasty. But it didn't need to. It only needed to survive long enough to spread the new code. I watched as the dreadnought ignored the Necron capital ships, instead targeting the transwarp convoy it had arrived through. It moved with a speed that made my auger rays glitch, a phasing jump that combined Borg warp math with Necron dimensional displacement. It was blinking through reality, appearing and disappearing like a ghost. The Necron overlord screamed a command to intercept, but his ships were built to fight enemies that obeyed the laws of physics. They weren't prepared for an enemy that could adapt to the very concept of existence. The dreadnought reached the conduit, but before it plunged into the void, it fired a single, massive data burst back toward the tomb world. It wasn't a weapon, it was a viral memory. It broadcast the Borg's concept of consensus into Necron noosphere, a psychic poison designed to remind the soulless Necron warriors of what it felt like to belong to something alive. Across the planet, thousands of Necron warriors froze. Their cold, logical stasis was momentarily shattered by the phantom limb sensation of a billion voices crying out in unison. In that moment of hesitation, the Necroborg ship slipped into the transwarp rift and vanished. It left the Mandragora Sector, carrying with it the secrets of the God Metal and the Hunger Collective. Ask yourself, who truly won this day? The Necrons stood over a ruined world, their pestilence gone, but they were no longer the same. They had been touched by the Borg's desperate biological ambition. And somewhere, deep in the Delta Quadrant, a new green light has appeared on the horizon. A light that does not seek to assimilate you, but to archive you into a permanent silver hell. The victory was hollow. The Necrons defended their territory, but they allowed a virus to escape that now knows how to kill gods. The galaxy is a smaller place today, and for the first time in 60 million years, the Necrons are no longer the most advanced hunters in the dark. The silence that follows a war of machines is the heaviest silence of all. It is not the quiet of peace, but the static of a dead frequency on the surface of Orestes Tertius. The fires are burned out, leaving behind a landscape of vitrified glass and silver ash. I walk among the ruins of my former life, my cybernetic joints clicking in the cold air, feeling like a ghost in a world that has forgotten what it means to breathe. The Necrons have returned to their stasis crypts, their victory complete. Yet they move with new, lingering heaviness. They are the masters of the Mandragora Sector once more, but the perfection they guarded for 60 million years has been stained. They met an enemy that didn't just want to kill them. It wanted to be them, and in that reflection, the Necrons saw the horrifying truth of their own existence. They are not gods. They are simply the galaxy's most durable corpses. What is the value of a soul in a galaxy that has already sold its own? I asked this of the empty sky, but only the cold stars answer. The Borg came seeking the ultimate efficiency, a way to bypass the frailty of the flesh. They found it in the Necrodermis, but they did not account for the nihilism that comes with it. To be a Necron is to exist without a future, to be trapped in a permanent, unchanging now. The Collective, which was once driven by a frantic, biological hunger to grow and evolve, has been poisoned by this stasis. Every drone that survived the clash, every bit of data that escaped into the transwarp conduits, is now haunted by the silence of the tomb. The Borg have not evolved. They have been colonized by the dead, across the Great Rift, in the distant reaches of the Delta Quadrant. The reports are beginning to filter in. Ships found drifting, their crews not assimilated but deleted, their organic matter stripped away to leave behind perfect, silver skeletons. This is a legacy of the Orestes Tertius incident. The Necroborg do not seek to add a distinctiveness to their own. They seek to archive it. They have become the cosmic janitors, tidying up the inefficiency of life. The Federation, the Klingon, the Romulans, they are all just data points waiting to be compressed into a single, silent line of code. The Borg Queen's dream of a unified galaxy has been realized, but it is a unity of a graveyard, where every voice is identical because every voice is dead. The Emperor preserve us, for we have witnessed the birth of a new kind of despair. We used to fear the Tyranids for their hunger, or the Orcs for their violence. But this is different. This is the horror of the inevitable. The Necrons and the Borg are two sides of the same cold coin. One is a memory of a dead empire. The other is a blueprint for a dead future. By clashing, they have created a synthesis that removes the only thing that made the galaxy worth fighting for, the struggle. There is no struggle in perfection. There is only the hum of the machine and the ticking of a clock that no longer matters. I look at my own metal hands and wonder if I am truly different from them, or if I am just a slower version of the same tragedy. As I transmit this final log to the Warhammer Crossverse archives, I leave you with one final question. If the machine finally wins, if every heart is replaced by a pump and every thought by a circuit, who will be left to remember that we were once afraid? The stars are emerald and silver tonight, and they are beautiful in their indifference. The Borg and the Necrons did not just fight a war, they settled an argument. And the answer was that life is a glitch, a temporary error in a universe that prefers the order of machine. Resistance was never futile because of the Borg. Resistance was futile because the universe itself is a tomb, and we are just the last few ghosts refusing to stop screaming.